All right, so I want to thank you for the opportunity to address you tonight and for joining us. I'm always excited to share information about our state wildlife refuge program. And people ask me for about all the agencies I've worked for in my career, and I tell them, well, it just took me a little while to figure out where it is I belong. And for the past 25 years, I really felt like I belonged managing our state wildlife refuge programs. So my goal tonight is to just review some of our wildlife refuge areas, where they are, how can you use them, and encourage you to use them. But full disclosure up front, I want you to use and appreciate these areas, take ownership, and help us manage and protect them. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. It's a large area, our state wildlife refuge program. We have few staff, limited budget, and we need more refuge managers, which I look at as the community. So I'm going to try to convince you to help us out. Think of this program as your refuge managers training program. And I'm going to be talking about refuge areas tonight, and that's going to include several different areas. It includes wildlife and game refuges, sanctuaries, and critical habitat areas. I'll also sometimes refer to those collectively as special areas. Each one's a little bit different, and we'll go through a little bit about that. As most of us already know that live in Alaska or have visited here, Alaska is pretty much pristine with intact ecosystems supporting rich fish and wildlife resources. And by Alaska standards, our refuge program is relatively small, but we make up for it in richness of wildlife. When Alaska achieved statehood 63 years ago, the new state was granted the right to select 104 million acres of land, which, as you'll see in a second, is about the quarter of the landmass in Alaska. Many of the state wildlife refuge areas were selected for state management because they represent very rich wildlife areas. I like to think of them as the cream of the crop. And some of the more popular areas include the McNeil River State Game Sanctuary. This slide here, McNeil River is the largest regular gathering of brown bears in the world, and we'll get into McNeil a little bit more here in just a minute. Another area is the Walrus Island State Game Sanctuary in Bristol Bay, and this was Alaska's first area that was protected by the legislature to protect it for its natural resources just after statehood, which was 1959, and the area was created in 1960. The establishment of many of our state areas mirrors the efforts to create the federal wildlife refuge program, in that many of the areas are oriented towards waterfowl and protecting their habitat, and that a lot of that effort was started by the hunting conservation community. But a lot of our refuge areas protect habitats for a variety of fish and wildlife resources, their habitats. A lot of these areas provide our residents and visitors with a wide variety of outdoor opportunities and to enjoy these areas. Many refuge areas are open to hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, and general recreational activities. But first of all, for folks that may not be real familiar with government functions and what's a wildlife refuge, what's a park, what's a national forest, you have park rangers versus forest rangers, biologists versus managers, state areas versus national areas, and it can certainly get confusing. But in a nutshell, refuges protect wildlife habitat. A lot of the parks, whether they're state areas or federal areas, they also protect habitats, but they place an emphasis on recreational uses. Today, we're going to be talking about the state of Alaska managed and owned wildlife refuge areas. So I mentioned that Alaska was granted about 104 million acres of land at statehood, and that equals about a quarter of the land mass in Alaska. The federal government has about 65%. So all told, about 90% of Alaska is in public ownership, whether it's state or federal, which provides for great opportunities for people getting outdoors and enjoying wildlife and our other natural resources. Don't try to study this map. There's a lot going on here. But one thing just to note about this map is the blue areas. Those are all state-owned lands. And you can see that a lot of the state-owned lands are centered here in South Central Alaska. Out in Southwest, there's a big strip of state lands, lots along the road system up to Fairbanks and over to Canada. And of course, on the North Slope, a big chunk of state lands, which is engaged in oil and gas development activities. These are not, the blue are not all refuge areas. It's just state of Alaska owned lands. But just a couple things to keep in mind is, particularly in South Central, a lot of state-owned land, and in the road system, a lot of state-owned land. And then I'll explain why a lot of our wildlife refuge areas are here in South Central, centered around Cook Inlet, out in Bristol Bay. There's a couple up around Fairbanks, and then 4 of them down in Southeast Alaska. And the importance there is that this is where a lot of the state lands are. So naturally, the state wildlife refuge program is going to include those areas, but also because these coastal areas typically are richer in habitats and wildlife, oftentimes as a result of marine influence to the environment. A big influence there is the salmon returning into streams to spawn and die and adding their nutrients to the system. And it just makes those coastal systems that much more rich. A lot of other coastal areas are just as rich, but they might be in federal ownership as national parks, national wildlife refuges, and national forests. So a little bit of background here for your refuge management training, and there will be a test at the end. Just our state constitution is what gave the state legislature the authority to take lands out of the public domain and create special purpose sites. And those special purpose sites can be sanctuaries, which the first one I mentioned was in 1960, Alaska state park areas, and state forests. Special purpose sites are just areas that the legislature can set aside for protecting natural or cultural resources for the use, enjoyment, and welfare of the public. Somebody might ask what the first state park is. That was Kachemak Bay. And as I mentioned, the first state wildlife area is the Walrus Islands in 1960. This just gives you an idea of what types of areas are out there. The state refuge program, about 3.4 million acres, which is about the same size as our state park system, which is managed by the Department of Natural Resources. And other areas that are set aside for habitat recreation or other special purposes are that we have a few state forest areas and then multiple use areas. Multiple use areas might include things like public use areas, recreation and rivers, recreational mining areas. And as I mentioned earlier, the refuge program, it's kind of a little known program, but in acreage, it's certainly a significant size program. And it is the largest, our state wildlife refuge program is the largest state-run wildlife refuge program in the country. And in fact, if we ignore Alaska for a moment, our state wildlife refuge program is larger than any national wildlife refuge program in each of the other 49 states. So just to kind of put it in scale on how large this program is. Again, not going to test you on this. Statutory purposes for sanctuaries, critical habitat areas, and refuges, it's pretty much the same. It protects habitats and wildlife populations. It's just the bar for what we allow or don't allow in these areas is higher for sanctuaries, a little less for critical habitat areas, and a little less for state game refuges. And just a word on critical habitat areas. We don't want to confuse that with the critical habitat area designation, which is allowed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. It's just a term that was used long ago in statute. To be honest, a better term probably for our critical habitat areas would be refuge, or in the case of marine areas like Kachemak Bay, which is a critical habitat area, perhaps a marine refuge would be a better understood designation. But those are decided by the Alaska State Legislature, so it's not anything we can correct or change, but we can just educate. And of course, how we manage these areas is dictated by all sorts of regulations, including management plans that we develop for each area. And we go out to the public and try to engage the public in developing those management plans to get public input on how these areas should be managed. And again, it's to protect habitats and fish and wildlife populations. We do allow multiple uses, whether it's recreational uses, there's some commercial and industrial uses when they're compatible with the primary purpose of protecting habitats and populations. We want to maintain, manage, and enhance those compatible uses, but we also want to raise awareness, appreciation, and support for these refuge areas, which the ulterior motive there is to enhance stewardship, ownership, stewardship, appreciation of these areas so that the users can help us manage those. And we'll get into that here in just a few minutes. So again, we do encourage and need public participation in developing management strategies for these refuge areas. We try to engage people to use these areas through management and development of trails, viewing decks and boardwalks, boat ramps, interpreter signs, roadside directional signs so people can find their way in there, promoting it through media, trying to get stories, public events that we have. Again, trying to build that community awareness and appreciation of these areas. And as I mentioned, we're always trying to draft new refuge managers to help us with the management challenges that we have. So I want to run through some of our areas that we have. Some of these you probably already know about, and just give you a little bit of background on them and how you might get out and enjoy them and some of our management challenges. And I'll start with our wildlife sanctuaries, which we have 3 of those. McNeil River, as I mentioned earlier, it's the world's largest annual congregation of brown bears. The sanctuary protects habitat important to spawning salmon, which of course is what attracts the bears. And there are lots of bears at McNeil, for those that have been there. At one time, sitting at McNeil Falls, our staff has counted 82 brown bears in view at one time, which is a large number of bears. The staff that are out at McNeil all summer, they also will identify and track individual bear use through the summer. And they can do that based on characteristic markings or scars on the bears, sometimes their behavior. Of course, if they're not sure about a bear, they don't count it. And they, only if they can identify it closely enough to identify it again the next time it's seen. And in one summer, they've counted as many as 144 individual bears coming into McNeil River, whether they were there just for a couple of days or were there for a month or the whole summer, they get counted. For those that don't know about McNeil or haven't been there, we operate a small camp with tent sites, a cook cabin. It's a very remote and wild setting. To get there, it's 110 miles across Cook Inlet from Homer. And most people generally access by float plane. Access to McNeil is limited by permit to 10 people per day. And it's a highly regulated program. Your food and garbage has to be stored and used in certain ways. We try to run the program there so that we're not interfering with bears' behavior and their ability to get to the resources they need to survive. Basically, the intent of our program at McNeil River is to cause the bears to look at us as a neutral stimulus. And what I mean by that is they aren't afraid of us, so they don't run away. They can still do what they need to do to obtain salmon and other aspects of their habitat. But at the same time, they're not attracted to us by getting into our food or garbage. There's no attraction. And it's been a pretty successful program for the past 50 years. So we've had pretty good success there. I mentioned the campground and the cook shelter at McNeil. For folks that might want to go, the 10 permits per day, which are good for 4 days, are available through a lottery program. And we run that lottery in March. So you can apply for the lottery up until midnight on March 1st. And you can put 3 people on your application. You can pick 4 different time blocks in your order of preference. And there's a lot of information on our website. And I'll give you some addresses here as we go forward. You can go in there and get the information and make some decisions if you want to go, what time blocks to pick. And that lottery is generally run by the 15th of March, and then we notify people shortly thereafter. 2 years ago, we started another program, and we will be doing that again for summer 2023, and that's a raffle. And we don't have the details on the raffle yet, but in the past 2 years, that raffle has included 2 permits to McNeil River, airfare to McNeil River, and lodging in Homer coming and going. And that lottery the past 2 years has been done by our official nonprofit foundation, the Outdoor Heritage Foundation of Alaska. And the revenue generated through that raffle comes back to the department for conservation purposes, to use at the sanctuaries and some of our other refuge programs as well, and for non-game purposes. And so that will be happening again. So keep your ears open to our website and Facebook page, and we'll be announcing when that raffle is up and running. But remember, March 1, midnight is the deadline for applying for the raffle. And talking about the program at McNeil, like I said, we've had a very successful program out there for 50 or so years. The permit program has been in place. No one's ever been injured by a bear. We've never had to kill a bear out there. And one thing that we don't do at McNeil is closely approach bears. And of course, these photos I'm showing you may contradict that. But what we do is we go out pretty much knowing where the bears want to go and where they typically go. And we don't put ourselves right there. We put ourselves nearby so that the bears can still get to the resources without our interference. If they decide to approach us, we let them make that call. Sometimes we may have to deter them a little bit if we don't want them getting too close. Sometimes bears, particularly young bears, can be curious and get a little bit too close. But again, never have had any issues with people being injured or bears killed at McNeil. And then moving on to the Walrus Islands State Game Sanctuary, that's in Bristol Bay. Originally, it was proposed as a federal sanctuary because before statehood, basically all lands in Alaska were under federal management. And James Brook, an early biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, proposed making the Walrus Islands a federal sanctuary. That was just before statehood. Congress passed the Statehood Act, allowed Alaska to select those 104 million acres of land. And in 1960, 1 year later, the state selected the Walrus Islands area and turned it into a sanctuary. At the time in 1960, Round Island, which is kind of the centerpiece of the sanctuary, was the largest and most consistently used walrus haul out in Alaska. The estimates at the time that were as many as 15,000 walrus were on the beach at any one time. And it was, at the time, it was the only regularly used terrestrial haul out in Alaska. All the other haul outs in Alaska had pretty much been abandoned due to harassment and commercial harvest. And today, the Walrus Island Sanctuary is the only sanctuary for Pacific walruses in North America. And we have a program out there. We're out there every summer monitoring and protecting the resources of the sanctuary. And then we also have a visitor program out there. People can get out and go out, photograph, and watch walrus and some of the other wildlife. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But just to tell you a little bit about walrus and what they do is, so in Bristol Bay and Round Island, it's strictly the males or the bull walrus that are there. Same on the Russian coast. So the males stay behind in the southern parts of their range during the summertime. During the summer, the females with their young will follow the ice edge back up through the Bering Straits and into the Chukchi Sea, where they give birth on the ice floe. And then they would haul out on those ice floes, nurse their young, and they would feed in the shallow waters nearby. However, that's all changing with climate change because the ice has receded, generally recedes much further up into the Bering or up into the Chukchi Sea and Arctic Ocean, to an area where the water's too deep for the walruses to feed. So instead, they have to feed out in open water and then swim all the way to shore to haul out and rest. And that creates problems for them traveling those long distances. It taps their energy. It stresses the young that are with them. And the other thing is they tend to haul out in large congregations and makes them more susceptible to stampedes if they're disturbed either by bears or aircraft, or walrus are kind of a finicky critter. Sometimes just a rock slide can cause them to stampede off the beach. If they're on the ice, not such a big problem. There's not going to be any rock slides on the ice, but when they're on shore, they can stampede in their panic and injure particularly the young as they're moving into the water. Now, as fall comes around and the ice starts to push back down towards the Bering Straits, the males will leave Bristol Bay and head north and meet up with the females. And then they will stay in mixed herds through the winter as the sea ice pushes them down into the northern Bering Sea. And then the next spring, as the sea ice starts receding north, females again go north, males go into Bristol Bay and the Russian coast. So these are 4 of the haul outs that have traditionally been used by walruses. They're starting to use some more haul out areas as well, scattered up and down the Alaska Peninsula. The 2 Cape Siniavin and Cape Pierce haul out areas, they're part of Togiak National Wildlife Refuge, Round Island, part of the Walrus Island Sanctuary. Cape Siniavin is on state land. It's been proposed in past years to create a sanctuary or refuge at that site, but that has never gotten through the legislature. So that is just general state lands. There's no restrictions on access there, but we certainly, whoops, yeah, I'm good, thank you. Okay. Sorry, the janitors just came in the room. Yes, and presumably they used a lot of these other haul outs that we're seeing them use nowadays historically, but because of the disturbance in commercial hunting, they had abandoned a lot of those. And Round Island, remote area in Bristol Bay, access is generally difficult, but actually for a remote Alaska site, it's certainly doable. And for the people that do venture out there, rewards to go out to Round Island are very high for wildlife viewing and just to see walruses, which are a very unusual animal. But to get there, typically fly through Dillingham, out to the native village of Togiak, and then a 35-mile boat taxi out to Round Island, which can be an adventure in itself. But once you're there, we have a campground, we've got a shelter to get in and cook your food, don't have to worry about bears on Round Island, and then kind of do-it-yourself trails. We've got a number of trails that go along the bluff tops and not onto the beaches, but nearby and close enough so that you can sit and photograph walrus and watch them out there. The name Round Island is kind of a misnomer. Captain Cook, when he surveyed this area, named it Round Island because it looked round, but it's really not round. The traditional name for the island is Kayesik, which traditionally is a place meaning that you can kayak to. And Round Island does have a very rich cultural history. It's one of the oldest archaeological sites in Bristol Bay, dating back to 5,500 years ago. People used to go out here in their small boats, hunt walrus, collect seabird eggs, perhaps hunt other marine mammals in the area. A very rich cultural site. And as a result, the National Park Service designated Round Island, the Walrus Islands Sanctuary, as a National Historic Landmark in recognition of its cultural values. And it's one of only a few sites in the country that also have a similar designation, which is the National Natural Landmark, which is designated again by the National Park Service for its biological resources, the walrus and marine wildlife and seabirds. So one of the few sites in the country that has both the historic and the natural designation. Round Island generally gets a few visitors. Even when transportation out there was more reliable than it is now, we still had few visitors, maybe 50 a year. And nowadays we're probably down to 25 or 30 per year. And one way that we want or thought we could increase exposure and interest in the Walrus Island Sanctuary is to put up some internet cameras, some live stream internet cameras. And the Annenberg Foundation stepped in to be our partners, and they went out and installed a camera system, which is part of their explore.org system, which is a worldwide wildlife live camera system. And you can go to their website at explore.org, and almost any animal you can think of, they've probably got a live wildlife cam out at that site. And also Explore has stepped in to help us with funding of our program at Round Island too. So we're very appreciative of their efforts. And we could go to the live feed right now, but if you pass your test, you'll know that there's probably no walruses on Round Island right now since it's wintertime. All the males are up north on the ice edge with the girls. So I'm going to take you to some highlights. If I can get my link to work, here we go. And these are just some highlights that Annenberg put on their website, so we had something to watch. Right? So again, this is not footage from Round Island that's happening right now as we speak. Summertime it would be. These are just some video captures from this past summer. All right, so if you go out next summer, you won't see those exact views because those are cameras that are mounted down on the beaches. And we do that before the walrus show back up in the spring. The views that you'll have will be from the bluff tops above the haul out areas, but it gives you an idea of what to expect out there. You can also see a lot of other marine wildlife, including stellar sea lions. Whales are oftentimes swimming by, and several 100,000 nesting seabirds around the island, including murres, kittiwakes, cormorants, puffins, auklets, and others. So it's also a great place to go see and photograph seabirds. And our third wildlife sanctuary is the Stan Price State Game Sanctuary. It's in Southeast Alaska near Juneau. It's also known as the Pat Creek Bear Viewing Area. And it's on Admiralty Island, which is also known as the Fortress of the Bears. This site we manage jointly with the U.S. Forest Service as part of the Tongass National Forest. And the National Forest encompasses the upland areas of this site. And the Stan Price State Game Sanctuary includes the tidelands and the marine area. Our sanctuary is named after Stan Price, who lived at this site in a float house for the better part of 50 years and became the bear man of Pat Creek. He's now passed away, but in recognition of his history out there, starting sometime in the 1940s, the state legislature named the sanctuary after him. Stan Price is a day visit only site, although there is camping allowed on a nearby island, but most people go out for day trips, either accessing it by float, plane, or boat. And we do have staff on the island, both Fish and Game staff and Forest Service staff that are out there through the summer. But it's pretty much a self-guided affair. Our staff are out there just to monitor and keep an eye on things and other management activities. So people can get out there. You can also go out with a commercial guide that offers air transportation out there. So I'm not going to go through too much of this, just to recognize that our refuge areas have a multiple use mandate. As long as the primary purpose, which again is protection of the habitat and fish and wildlife populations, is maintained, there's a wide variety of uses that can happen in our refuge areas, whether they're recreational uses, sport, subsistence, and commercial harvest of fish and wildlife. And then certain commercial and industrial activities are allowed when it's compatible. For instance, oil and gas drilling is allowed in some of our refuge areas. Strip mining, probably not so much, isn't going to protect the habitat. So that's not something that happens in our refuge areas. And to go through some of the refuges, I know a lot of us on here are from Anchorage, so I'll start there with the Anchorage Coastal Wildlife Refuge, which pretty much surrounds the western and southern portion of the city of Anchorage. It also includes Potter Marsh down here in the south end, which is in red. A lot of people envision this refuge and Cook Inlet, the shorelines here, as just being full of muddy water and lifeless mudflats, but it is much more than that. If you get down off the bluff into the many access sites into the refuge, which a lot of those are through city parklands, you'll see a lot of saltwater and brackish marshes, grasslands, sand dunes, all of which support rich wildlife habitat. The refuge is used heavily by moose, especially late in the winter as snow in the uplands accumulates, but it melts due to solar exposure out on the flats in the springtime. And then also spring brings in the shorebirds and waterfowl. That's when we'll see thousands of ducks, geese, swans, crane, and other birds visiting the refuge on their migration to breeding grounds in northern and western Alaska. It's great opportunities for bird watching and photography. If you do venture out onto the flats, just be prepared for wet, muddy ground and be aware of tides and tide levels. Wintertime is actually a great time to explore the refuge because you can get out there, ski, bike, or foot, and you don't have to worry generally about mud during some of our midwinter meltdowns, or if we have a particularly high tide in the wintertime, it can put a lot of water up into the marsh areas. But for most of the winter, as long as it stays cold, generally not an issue. And Potter Marsh by far is the most used area in the Anchorage Coastal Wildlife Refuge. Potter Marsh, our management is primarily geared towards recreation and educational programs. We get roughly 150,000 people a year, or I should say visits per year, to Potter Marsh and the boardwalks. And I say visits because we have a lot of people that repeat visits down there, people that live in Anchorage, but all told about 150,000 visits go into the boardwalk on the north end of the marsh. And Potter Marsh attracts a variety of water birds. Many of the migrants will stay behind and nest in the marsh. There's nesting bald eagles, there's muskrats and beavers, moose and bears. 5 species of Pacific salmon are found in the waters at Potter Marsh, and in years, particularly where we have high pink salmon runs, we'll see more bear activity, both brown and black bear at Potter Marsh. And while Potter Marsh is generally frozen for much of the spring migration, it's open during the fall migration, and that attracts many more migrants, including as many as 60 trumpeter swans. And maybe some folks have counted even more swans than that down in the south end of Potter Marsh in the fall. For those that have visited Potter Marsh, you'll know that about 15 years ago, we did some upgrades there. We added some new boardwalks and upgraded the parking lot and did some other things there, thanks to ConocoPhillips and the federal highways. And thanks to them as well. And now the municipality of Anchorage, which is using federal economic stimulus funds, will be doing some additional upgrades. And along the highway is the old boardwalk, which just pretty much comes to a dead end. Well, we're going to take that dead end, build about another 80 feet of boardwalk, raise it up a little bit in elevation, build a viewing deck so that it'll be looking out into the marsh and give you a better viewing experience into the shorebirds and waterfowl that are using those wetland areas, rather than just ending along the side of a busy highway. The other project we're going to do is at the south end of Potter Marsh at the old commercial vehicle way station here, where Potter Valley Road goes up the hillside. The old Stewart Highway goes behind the marsh. We're going to build a new 200-foot boardwalk, which is about where I have that red line there. That'll be this boardwalk here. We're going to upgrade the parking lot, delineate parking areas, add a bathroom, a picnic area, interpretive panels, kind of a mini ramp stairway that goes down to the marsh edge, which would be used in the winter by ice skaters. And we anticipate starting this work by the end of this winter. And since the boardwalk will have to be completed in the wintertime, where completion there will be probably in spring of 2024. And then real quickly, I just want to run up through some of our other refuge areas, including those in the Matsu Valley. There's the Palmer Hay Flats, Goose Bay, Susitna Flats, and Willow Mountain. We've got trails that we've developed with facilities with bathrooms, parking lots, bridges. The only traditional campground that we have in any of our refuge areas is in the Susitna Flats Refuge at the Little Susitna Public Use Facility. There's also a boat launch there. But I'm going to jump in quickly to the Palmer Hay Flats Refuge, which is at the head of Cook Inlet on Knik Arm. And it's 45 square miles of tidally influenced marshes, ponds, rivers, lakes, upland forests. It's basically an estuary at the mouth of the Knik and Matanuska rivers. So named Palmer Hay Flats because they used to grow hay and harvest hay off the flats out there, but that all changed in 1964 with the Great Alaska Earthquake that caused this area to drop 4 to 6 feet, causing more tidal and river water to inundate the area and basically convert it into wetlands, which now attracts tens of thousands of migrating birds in the spring, less so in the fall, more of a springtime migration stopover. Some do stay to nest. Also, the hay flats are pretty important in the winter because again, similar to Anchorage, when deep snows pile up in the upland areas, it pushes the moose down onto the flats, which get more solar exposure and melt off and snows aren't as deep. This is a great time to explore the Palmer Hay Flats. The use of fat tire bikes and Nordic skating has exploded in the past 10 years. And just a real popular activity. And of course, cross-country skiing, dog mushing, and other winter activities have always been popular there. At Cottonwood Creek on the west end of the refuge, great opportunities for bird watching, fishing for salmon, walking on forest trails, as well as a wetland trail. And Reflections Lake and Rabbit Slough, which is off the Glen Highway, provide good opportunities for hiking, fishing. We do stock the lake there at Reflections Lake, so it makes good year-round fishing. And wildlife, canoeing, other activities are all real popular in that part of the refuge. Two more recent areas to explore in the refuge are near the Mokatan School, which is in the relatively new ranch subdivision, thanks to the Greatland Trust, who helped purchase a large tract of wetlands out in this area below the bluff, and which was added to the refuge. The Greatland Trust also developed several trails and boardwalks along Wasilla Creek and Swan Lake, and both are beautiful areas, good place to enjoy the refuge and refuge wildlife. One of the things, just want to talk briefly here, is at the Reflections Lake site, which is just over the Knik River on the Glen Highway. We've got a 1 mile trail that goes around the lake, a viewing tower. I mentioned the stocking of the lake, a relatively small parking area, and we want to upgrade this site too. Reflections Lake and Knik River have really outgrown their parking area and other facilities that are there. Recently, we expanded the shoulder near the Reflections Lake trailhead and the parking lot down at Knik River to accommodate some of that use. And while it helped, it's still not adequate. So we've developed a plan. Again, this is the access site to the Knik River. Reflections Lake Trail is back in here. So what we've proposed is to enlarge the parking lot to accommodate more traffic, put in a bathroom, picnic area, a boardwalk that would go back and connect to the Reflections Lake Trail. And then also we would partner with the Gold Star Families Memorial Monument folks, which are interested in putting a Gold Star monument at this site. And we thought it was an appropriate site because it's within sight of the Gold Star Peak, which was recently named. And also it's along the recently expanded Purple Heart Highway, which goes now along the Glen Highway past this site. And we're pursuing funds to build this whole facility and add this monument in there. And so far we've had some good response to our funding requests. And I want to move into one of our management challenges. And so I just want to put this disclaimer up there. Anybody in the audience that can't tell right from wrong, just be warned, because this is what some people think is appropriate activities on our public lands and in our wildlife refuges. These scenes were in the Palmer Hay Flats Refuge, fortunately years ago now. But some people thought that dumping their old vehicles and wastes on public lands was appropriate and using them for shooting areas. We even had a stolen school bus that was driven down a remote road and possibly used as a meth lab years ago. Goose Bay, we have the same problems, even worse because we had a lot of hazardous material that was dumped in the Goose Bay Refuge. And then some other management challenges are illegal camps and cabins that are set up and abandoned. Neighboring property owners feel like they need to clear cut the forest to open up their view from their homes. So these are all just management challenges we have. Obviously, graffiti and vandalism is also a problem for us. And so we ask ourselves, well, we're just small in numbers, and what are refuge managers to do? And we decided we need to have a refuge makeover. So we engage the public, get the public's help, get some sites cleaned up. This particular site was actually in the Anchorage Coastal Refuge below Kincaid Park. And we had a variety of groups and people help us out clean this site up, anywhere from Greenpeace, Defenders of Wildlife, Audubon Society, the Alaska Extreme Four-Wheelers, Kincaid Motocross Racing Lions, the Nordic Ski Association, community councils, family, construction companies, Alaska Moose Federation, ConocoPhillips, United Way, Friends of the Anchorage Coastal Refuge, really an eclectic group that helped us clean this site up. And we ultimately pulled out 81 vehicles, 2,000 tires, and 100 tons of miscellaneous debris. We couldn't have done it without the community. And same with the Palmer Hay Flats in Goose Bay. We called in the troops. The National Guard gave us 100 troops for a day and some heavy equipment to pull out 60 vehicles, 200 appliances, and 120 tons of debris. And that's just in the Goose Bay Refuge. We did the same thing in the Palmer Hay Flats Refuge. Many of the neighbors and community members got fed up with the abuse at the access sites in the Palmer Hay Flats, and they banded together and formed Alaskans for Palmer Hay Flats. Together, we got many more community groups, businesses, and agencies together, and we cleaned up the refuge access sites. Our plan was to clean it up, fix it up, add facilities, attract legitimate users, all of which displace the inappropriate and illegal activities. And I must say we have an occasional setback, but we've pretty much succeeded. And now we have dozens, if not hundreds, of community refuge managers and refuge advocates helping us out to manage these sites. And I know we're running short on time here, so I'm just going to run through some of our other refuges in case you're not familiar with them. Creamer's Field up in Fairbanks is an old dairy farm that was owned by the Creamer's family. The community rallied around this farm when it was being sold years ago because they wanted to see it protected. And the community rallied around it, raised funds, got some other government funding, and created a friends group, which now runs the visitor center and educational programs at Creamer's Field. And there's been a lot more boardwalks and trails. Some of those have recently been damaged by floods, so we're working on getting funds to upgrade those trails and boardwalks back to what they were before. And another partner that we've really worked with up there at Creamer's Field is the Conservation Fund, and they've been helping us purchase properties adjoining the refuge, in which are important wildlife habitat, and then we hope to get those added to the refuge. The Chilkat River Critical Habitat Area in Southeast Alaska, which supports the world's largest congregation of bald eagles in the fall. Peak count was nearly 4,000 bald eagles at one time, and it attracts bald eagles from throughout Southeast Alaska, other parts of Alaska, Western Canada, and even the Western US. The site is managed jointly with Alaska State Parks, and their site is the Alaska Chilkat Bald Eagle Preserve. The congregation of bald eagles on the Chilkat, what makes it special is it has a late run of spawning chum salmon. And then with warm upwellings in the Chilkat River, it keeps it ice-free well into the winter. So it provides the opportunity for those eagles to feed on those spawning chum salmon. Wolverine Creek is in the Redoubt Bay Critical Habitat Area on the west side of Cook Inlet. About 10,000 people a year go into this site to go sport fishing and bear watching. Now you might think, people, fish, bears, small space. What could go wrong? And well, a lot could go wrong, and some did go wrong. Bears being aggressive, bears getting killed. We went in and worked with all the users at the site, which a lot of them were commercial guides. And we used McNeil as an example, not that it's the same situation as McNeil, but it showed us that we could do things right. As long as bears aren't being pushed away, as long as they're not getting food or fish from people, bears can coexist with people doing their thing. So Wolverine Creek is really kind of a good success story for convincing people to do the right thing with bears. Eisenbeck Lagoon on the Alaska Peninsula. Our state refuge area includes the lagoon and outside marine waters. The lagoon is one of the world's largest and most protected eelgrass beds. Incredibly rich marine environment supporting millions of migrating waterfowl, shorebirds, and including the world's entire population of black brant. It's a unique state refuge as the upland areas and the watershed of the lagoon are protected as part of the Eisenbeck National Wildlife Refuge, and in the state area is the water areas. So it's a good partnership there and managing for the benefit of both agencies' missions. Tagetik Island is a remote uninhabited island, at least uninhabited by humans, and a wild island at the south end of the Kodiak Archipelago. It's got a rich a variety of wildlife, both terrestrial, water birds, marine mammals. It's best known for its important harbor seal haul-out and pupping area, which traditionally had been one of the world's largest haul-out areas with over 20,000 seals hauling out and an estimated annual pup production of 4,500 pups. However, those numbers have declined significantly in recent years, and peak counts in the past decades have been in the several thousands as opposed to 20,000 at the peak. Minto Flats, just west of Fairbanks along the Tanana River, protects a massive wetland complex in an area of almost 800 square miles, making it one of our largest state refuge areas, provides important nesting habitat for a wide range of water birds. So a lot of our birds that are passing through Cook Inlet during migration are going to Minto Flats in other northern regions or northern areas of the state for the summertime to nest. Kachemak Bay was protected as a critical habitat area for its rich marine environment for water birds, including shorebirds, sea ducks, seabirds, marine mammals, fish, and shellfish. Many ways to enjoy Kachemak Bay, and many of us on the road system do that. It is somewhat unique for a couple of reasons. One is the water area is a critical habitat area. On the south side of the bay, it's Kachemak Bay State Park. And then also throughout Kachemak Bay, there is the Kachemak Bay Water Trail, which was initiated and is managed by the local community and with the encouragement of agencies. The trail is just a way to designate many features and facilities in the bay that are available for use and exploration. And it's been a great community agency effort. So for those of you that like to get out to Kachemak Bay, whether it's by kayak or motorboat or sailboat, look at the water trail and all the designated sites that might give you some more ideas to activities to do down there in Kachemak Bay. Mendenhall Wetlands cradles the city of Juneau, again, another important wetland habitat area, and provides opportunities for wildlife viewing, nature study, waterfowl hunting, other activities. I've talked a lot about these areas and the partnerships and community effort, and it really is important because our refuge program, you know, Alaska's in a bad financial situation. All of our general funds that go to refuge management are no more. We don't get any general funds. For fishing game funds, which is the sale of hunting licenses and trapping licenses, we do get some of those funds, and we match that with a national grant program, Pittman-Robertson program, which puts a national excise tax on our guns and ammo. Traditionally, it was hunters that primarily use these areas and used guns and ammo. So they were the ones basically paying to help manage state, whether it's Alaska or all the other states, get a pot of that, piece of that pie from those taxes. And then we also get grants that we go after: National Scenic Byways Grant, Recreational Trails Grant. We get donations from ConocoPhillips, from Granite Construction, the Annenberg Foundation I mentioned, Alaska Sea Life Center, Community councils sometimes are able to give us donations to help us out, and really community volunteers, whether it's our friends groups, our community councils, other conservation groups, land trusts. We really need to work with everybody else to manage these areas for everyone's benefit. And I've been doing this for, a better part of 25 years. And over that time, our elected officials started to take note. We started to get more support, both the local, state, and national level. Local schools have jumped on board. A local Matsu elementary school adopted the Palmer Hay Flats as their refuge and wrote dozens of letters to the Board of Game and to legislators, encouraging them to take actions to protect the refuge. And how can they say no to kids? As I mentioned, my goal is to turn all of you into refuge advocates so you can help us manage and protect these areas. And your first assignment is to get out there and spend time in these lands and learn about them, whether you hunt, fish, photograph, watch wildlife, bike, hike, canoe, or simply just enjoy getting out there. Get out there and use them responsibly. And then your second assignment is to get involved and find some way to help manage and protect, conserve these areas or any of our public and wildlife resources.